Hi. Hi, could somebody give me a thumbs up if they can hear me okay? Or a heart, or anything? Hi Paul, how's it going? Brilliant, thank you very much. Just give it another couple of seconds and then we'll get going. Blessings to you as well. Hi Charlie. Are you really getting old? Hi Jamie. Well, I think we're all getting old with you. Good evening, John. How's it going? Sun-drenched Cheltenham. Yeah, it's reasonably sunny out here. It's quite nippy though. Well, we'll get going this evening. I don't know how the subtitles came on last time. I must have pressed something, and I have no idea what, and I don't know whether they're on today or not. Also, I've got a sneaking suspicion that last time I called Judas a zealot. Sunny Abergavenny, lovely. Judas wasn't the zealot, Simon was the zealot. Now and then I get my names mixed up, and you'll become used to that. It's one thing with having had a stroke. It's I don't know. You seem to say things that your brain isn't thinking, and it's quite weird. So today I'm gonna talk about the disciples. I thought, seeing as we just finished talking about Jesus, it seemed a natural place to go to talk about the disciples. And Jesus called 12 disciples to serve as his closest helpers and companions, but they weren't the only people around at the time, as we'll hear. In John 1, 37 to 49, he relates the calling of Andrew, Peter, James, John, Philip and Nathaniel. Matthew threw a party and he joined the group. Philip brought Nathaniel, also known as Bartholomew, Thomas, a twin, James, cousin to Jesus, Simon the Zealot, Thaddeus, and Judas. Now, lots of us claim to know all the names of the disciples. Lots of us don't. Where did they all come from in the story? And A great deal of people assume that the disciples were there from day one, but they weren't. Jesus was building a group of people who followed him at first. Knowingly or not, he was gaining a reputation, and people wanted to see what he was doing. From the first disciples to be called were Andrew and Simon, the one Jesus called Cephas, where they were followers of John the Baptist. And two men were there when John said that Jesus was the Messiah. Andrew listened and went to get his brother and followed Christ. It's likely that the other man who was with Andrew at the time was John, because John never named himself in his gospel. So it's likely that the two people who were there originally when John the Baptist said about Christ was Andrew and John. And Andrew went to get Simon, and John probably went to get James. And then Jesus found Philip, and all of them were from Bethsaida. And Philip found Nathanael, and it is very feasible that Andrew, Simon, James and John had spent time with Jesus a day or two before he called them. We are marrying here John's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel up. Fishermen would go out to do their fishing at night or early in the morning and have the afternoons to themselves. And so it's very possible that they met Christ in the afternoon after being with John and spent time with him, then went home and out to do their work, and Christ came along after they had come in from fishing and were mending their nets. And he said, "Come follow me." And they left the nets and followed him. They must have been slight radicals anyway, because they were followers of John, and John had told them that there was someone coming after him, and then he points out Jesus to be that person. Jesus asks Simon to cast his net out on the opposite side of the boat when he's just met them. And I think in doing this, Jesus was making a statement there off the bat. He was saying, what men do is not what God does. And often my way is opposite to the world's way of doing things. And in doing so, Jesus was showing them that his way brought results. The disciples had just made the biggest haul that they had ever had, which transferred into a lot of money, potentially turning their lives around. But they chose to leave everything and follow Jesus. Why are we all following Jesus? Potentially for the same reasons. Because he's changed our lives around. Instead of them coming to Christ to gain stuff, to gain things, they had been given it and had left it all behind to follow him. Christ had given them a fortune in fish, and they left it and they followed him. We can see that God is not not unwilling to bless and prosper, but the fishermen saw something far more valuable than money in the person of Christ. How would we react if this was us in this story? How would we react if we had just been given a fortune and Christ said, leave that and follow me? Would we follow him? When we ask God for something and he comes through, do we just thank him? Or do we realize that the presence of God and the invitation into the adventure of life is far greater? When we don't look at the situation and say, God came through for me. Or do we realize the magnitude of God's presence? Do we say, I could walk away from this, no problem. All I want is the presence of Jesus. Somebody said to me once that if we get up to heaven and heaven is just a big empty room with 2 chairs sitting in it, 1 chair for us and 1 chair for Jesus, would that be enough? And it would for me, because all I want is Jesus. I'm not bothered about the trappings. I'm not bothered about the other stuff. I'm just bothered about Jesus. And that may sound a little bit strange and silly, but Jesus is everything to me. And in this world, we often find that people are coming to Jesus because of what they can get. They come into Jesus and they're promised wealth and health and all these good things. But what we really need to be promising people is Jesus and Jesus alone. The wealth and the health may come, but on the other hand, it may not. But the only thing that we are sure of getting when we come to Christ is Christ. And that, I think, is paramount. If we think about this today, in some ways we are using our relationship with God just as we do our relationship with Father Christmas. And this is not a real relationship. What would you leave behind if God called you? What would you not leave behind to follow Jesus? And that's a matter of something for you to think about, be it your family, be it your friends, be it your loved ones. What would you not leave behind to follow Jesus? When did they come into Christ's story? The 6 were with him at the wedding at Cana when Jesus turned water into wine. And just as an aside, I'm sort of rather than bopping around amongst Gospels, I'm sort of using Luke as my my go-to Gospel, because he's got the majority of things there. I would leave everything behind, Paul, and I would too. And I think that's the mark of a Christian. But it's easy to say, it's not so easy to do. And the disciples just up and walked off. So the 6 of them were at the wedding at Cana. And if we go in by biblical details, there were only 6 on the Sermon on the Mount. However, many chronological guides place all the disciples there, although there is some debate about, as as to who was there. Whether they were appointed disciples before or after the Sermon on the Mount, according to Luke's Gospel, they were appointed disciples after. But the term disciple is a little bit erroneous, and we'll have a look at that later. We then see him choosing Matthew, being called by Jesus, and his name was Levi. And he's seen as a very controversial member of Christ's team. He invites Christ to a party because Christ asked him to join him on his mission. And immediately it gets up the noses of the Jewish hierarchy. Immediately Christ is sitting down with tax collectors and people of ill repute, and these are the type of people that Christ loves and relates to. And it's at this point that Christ starts dividing opinions. At this point, the disciples, although they weren't called disciples at the time, were asked by the Pharisees, why is he doing this? And can you put yourself in their shoes? The bigwigs of the community are asking you, why is this guy doing such things? Why is he knocking around with miscreants? Why is he hanging about with tax collectors? And it's equivalent to him hanging around with criminals and what have you today. And I can imagine the answer was, I don't know. And then Jesus steps in and saves their embarrassment and tells the Jewish hierarchy that he's there for the people who need him, not for the people who don't. We then hear about Christ choosing his disciples. He goes off and prays, and this is a constant with Christ. He goes off to pray and then makes a decision. And Christ would pray every day, and they wouldn't just be short prayers, they'd be reasonably lengthy prayers, maybe an hour or so. And it's in that prayer that you get the conversation with God. It's in that prayer time that you really come to know God's Spirit and what God's about. And I'm not saying for all of us to pray for an hour a day, but take time every single day to pray, whether it's a short period of time, but take time in the mornings to pray, because it's no good praying after the whole day is gone and you're praying about something that's happened. Pray at the morning, in the morning, because if you pray before you start your day, you've got God with you throughout your day. If you're praying at the end of the day, then you're praying after everything has gone on. So Jesus goes out to pray. He's consulting his dad about who's going to be the best people to choose. And it's at this point that we realize that Jesus had a vast number of people who were with him, who were following him around. And he is just choosing out of this vast number of people, the people who would be closest to him. In and around this section, it talks about people from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions of Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. This is an integral part of his ministry. We are just over a year in, and Jesus is choosing his 12. They have been following him now for a while. But so have a lot of other people. And now he becomes specific about the people he really wants close to him and the people who he wants to represent him in the world. This, I'm sure, is why we don't hear much about the others. We hear about them in a group, but we don't hear much about them individually. It's because they're part of the crowd, and we don't know where they come from in most cases. We know that there are more than just these 12 following him, because in those days quite a lot of people would follow a new Messiah, and there would have been an element of that in following Jesus, but there would also have been an element of, hang about, this guy's different. He's doing things in a different way. He's talking in a different manner. And there was quite an excitement and a buzz about Jesus all around the town. And that excitement and buzz over the years even got to Herod, and Herod specifically wanted to go and see him. Because as we know, Herod was, in a sense, quite a fan of John the Baptist, and he liked to listen to John the Baptist talking. But that's for another time. We know that, as I said, there were more than these in the Gospels, and it mentions other people, and women in particular, who helped Jesus in their ministry. Jesus is about 31 at the point when he chooses his disciples, and they were followers at this point, and then things change for them. They were about to become real disciples and leading them on to being apostles. Yeah, Herod Antipas. Disciple means one who engages in learning through instruction from another, a pupil or an apprentice. An apostle means one who is sent. So while a disciple is a student, one who learns from a teacher, an apostle is one who is sent out to deliver those teachings to others. And for years, I never knew the difference. I would change the word disciple for apostle and apostle for disciple, but they were disciples throughout their time with Jesus, but they became apostles then when Christ was sending them out. So Jesus chose the 12 to deliver his message to the world after their apprenticeship was over with the Master. We often think of the disciples as the guys who were here to help Jesus on his mission, and then they sort of muddled their way through afterwards. But Jesus specifically chose them. He specifically chose those 12 to be the core, the hub of the people that were around him. They were actually there to learn their craft. In Jewish tradition, up until the age of 10, you would memorize the Torah, and the majority of people would then drop out of school. But up until 10, every Jewish child was there to memorize the Torah. And then After 12, after 10, the majority would go off and learn a trade, and the best students would carry on until the age of 15, when they would memorize the rest of the Bible and then go off to do a trade. And the best of the best would become a rabbi's apprentice. So it was the absolute elite, those people who were far superior in learning and memorizing and understanding the Bible. They would become the rabbi's apprentice. So for Jesus, who was a rabbi, to take simple fishermen and tax collectors as disciples was completely backwards to the standard way, and this would have been really confusing to the Jewish people, because they were always used to one way of getting a rabbi, and here's Jesus completely turning it on its head, taking people who were effectively uneducated people who were the common working man, to quote Rush. They would take the common working man, and he would disciple them. They were not exceptional in any way. They were just ordinary men. And Jesus takes an exclusive club of religion and turns it into an inclusive family of God. He takes something that's completely exclusive and creates a system of exclusivity and turns it into an inclusive family, so that everybody can understand and everybody can learn on the same level, on the same basis, and everybody can come to God. Much of the time, what Jesus said to the disciples didn't make much sense to them. And it didn't make much sense because, not because they were stupid, but because they didn't have the learning. They had to learn on the job, so to speak. And he was talking about what was to come, and they hadn't seen it yet, and they didn't understand a lot of the references that Jesus made until a long time after. Many things he said will have fallen into place after his death and resurrection. Shortly after choosing his 12, he went out and said this, looking at his disciples: "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets." So his disciples were being left under no illusion of what was in store for them. He was telling them that they were going to be rejected by mankind, and they were going to be rejected by their own people. They were going to be seen as evil because they followed Jesus. He was telling them that their reward was in heaven, not on this earth. Then Jesus says, "Love your enemies." Can you imagine being Simon the Zealot when Jesus said that? Having fought against the Romans all his adult life, and now being told to love them. It must have been really messing his head up. He's set his stall. He's an advocate for getting rid of the Romans, and he hated the Romans. And now here's Jesus turning around and telling him that we've got to love our enemies. He's not going to just roll over and just accept what Jesus is saying. He's going to question, or at least question the other people in his group. If he wasn't close enough to Jesus to question Jesus. But you can imagine them having many a discussion about how are we supposed to love our neighbours? What impetus is there for me to love my neighbour when they are oppressing my nation? And you can imagine that they had quite a few heated discussions about this. When they were going to Nain, Jesus becomes overcome and with compassion for a widow whose dead son was being carried to his grave. So he raises the boy. How on earth do you think the disciples felt at this point? The guy that they'd been talking around, they'd seen him doing other miracles, bring him back somebody's sight or hearing, but raising somebody from the dead, that is incredible. And not even somebody he knew, not even a friend, not even somebody who had just died. This was a person whose son was being carried out with a mourning party all around them, people mourning for this woman's son. And Jesus just goes up and says, sit up. And it must have flabbergasted the disciples. He's just walking past and he does that. They would have felt amazed and terrified all at the same time, frightened. What sort of man are we following? What is he truly capable of if he can raise somebody from the dead? And at the drop of a hat, no preparation, no going specifically to see him. They're just walking into this town and this funeral procession passes them. And Jesus just goes over and heals a kid and raises him from the dead. This must have been flabbergasting for them. And this is the first time that we have seen Christ do something like this. And it must have completely freaked them out. Now, as well as the disciples, there were a number of people who were still following Jesus everywhere. Mary called Magdalene, for whom 7 demons had come out of, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. What does that actually mean? These women are very interesting. Mary Magdalene, who we all know, but Joanna must have been a very influential woman. She was married to the manager of Herod's household. Now, you don't just get that job just off the bat. They would have worked up to that position and maybe held other positions previously to that. But he's manager of Herod's household. Herod effectively is the king at that time. So he's equivalent, I suppose, to Joseph in his time. He's manager over all Herod's household. And his wife is wandering around the countryside supporting Jesus financially. They would have formed a travelling party which would have likely gone ahead of Christ to sort out sleeping arrangements and food for the evening, and they were paying for this out of their own pockets, out of Joanna's pocket, and there's another lady by the name of Susanna, and it references her, Joanna, as having been a woman who had been cured of demons or infirmities by Jesus, and had obviously given her life. And her husband obviously supported her in this. Otherwise, she would have been brought home straight away. But if she had demons or infirmities and she'd been cured of those, then her husband would have been very grateful to have his wife back. Susanna is another woman who was provided for Christ out of her resources. And I feel that she represents a number of others who were instrumental in keeping this whole road show on the go. And by this time there were quite a number of people who would have to have been fed and looked after in the evenings. So it was quite an undertaking for these women who were effectively in the background. There's one thing which was said to me. I got an autograph business by trade, and I run memorabilia events. And one guy came up to me who was actually the actor who played Pinhead in Hellraiser, and he said, all these shows that you do, and he's been to a number of them. He's a lovely guy, Doug. But he said everything goes swimmingly and really smoothly on the surface. But he said, I know that you were like a swan, graceful on the surface and paddling like mad underneath. So these women would have been the paddling like mad to keep the whole Jesus Roadshow on the go. And that's not meant to sound condescending to Christ. But there would have been a lot of logistical things to keep this number of people going on the road. And Jesus was moving from town to town. And the logistics of moving this number of people around with him would have been vast. When we come to the parable of the sower, the disciples ask, what does this mean? I wonder whether they had known all the other times what Jesus was talking about, or whether this was just the first time that they plucked up the courage to ask him. And in Jesus saying that their eyes had been opened to understand what he was saying, whether he opened their eyes at that point, because he explains the parable to them after saying, your eyes have been opened. So I'm wondering whether at that point his eyes, he opened their eyes to understand what he said. Is this actually the first time that they had truly understood what Jesus was saying? And did Jesus perform a miracle on them at that point to help them fully understand what he was saying? You have to gain the fact that Jesus wanted these people to carry on his legacy as he established an understanding amongst them. After all, he was only halfway through his ministry at this point, or a little before halfway. And he only had a limited period of time to work with them. And Jesus would have been aware of the limitations of his time period. Jesus would have been aware of this. So he knew full well that he had to get as much into them as was possible. In the storm, when they wake Jesus because they are frightened for their lives, Jesus gets up and tells the storm, quit it. Or in the Greek, it means muzzle it. And the disciples turn around and ask each other, who is this guy? Who is this that he commands the winds and the waves? And you can sort of imagine Jesus getting up saying, shut it, to the storm, and the storm quitting, and him going back to sleep after he's given them a rebuke. But they didn't really have a clue who he was. They'd been around him for over a year at this point, and maybe more. And they're possibly more clueless as to who Christ is at this point than at any other point, because he's doing things that are completely out of the norm, completely out of the ordinary, and completely out of the realms of what a normal prophet of God would do. You would think that they would have got it by now, but it takes a long time for them to figure it out. There were other circumstances where the disciples had to act as bodyguards, such as the story of the woman with the issue of blood. Can you imagine a crowd, like a crowd of the Beatles, surrounding him, and they are having to act like a human shield, and sort of rush Jesus through. And here's Jesus asking, who touched me? And you can imagine Peter's reply, are you daft? Can't you see all the people around you? There are people everywhere. It could have been anyone. Forget it. And let's get to where we are going. But Jesus is adamant. And they stay there with Jesus asking, who touched me? Until the woman comes up. They must have thought he was off his rocker. And yet, Jesus knew that someone had touched him, not just for the sake of touching him, but had touched him and had taken some power out of him. Then Jesus drops the bomb that they are about to be sent out. He sent them out in twos. He gave them a power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. This was Jesus testing the water. This was Jesus sending them out to see how they came back, how they responded, how they had taken on the knowledge that he'd given them this far. And he was testing the water to see how they reacted. Put yourselves in their shoes. You've seen Jesus doing all these things, and now it's your turn. They would have been terrified about doing this sort of thing. And can I put myself in their shoes? Yes. I've taken authority over a couple of demons on a couple of occasions, but they're the very rare occasions. And loads of times I've prayed for people to be healed but they haven't necessarily been healed. There was one or two occasions I've seen people healed after my prayer, and one occasion was a pretty spectacular occasion. I'd gone to visit a mate in hospital, and he was in hospital with heart failure, and he'd been there, unbeknownst to me, for a couple of weeks. And when we went to visit him, he said, I said, "Can I pray for you?" And he said yes. And I prayed for him, and I prayed for God to heal him, because he was 40-something at the time, and his work definitely wasn't done. And he used to be the lead singer of a band that I used to manage. And he said, "You know what?" He said, 12 different pastors have been to see me here, what with pastors that he knew, and the hospital pastors. And none of them have prayed for healing. All of them have just prayed for God's will to be done. And I turned round to him and said, "No, God's going to heal you, because you've got more things for you to do." And at that point, he was 3 days away from going in to have a heart transplant. Within a week, he was out of the hospital without having had a transplant, and the doctors couldn't believe what had happened to him. So it's a matter of keep praying for people. It doesn't matter what sort of response you think that you've got. You keep praying, and keep praying for healing, and God will decide who gets healed and who doesn't get healed. You just pray with the belief that God is going to heal, and sometimes he'll heal physically, but sometimes he'll heal spiritually or mentally. But God never leaves a prayer unresponded to. And yeah, we'd all like to be like I've forgotten his name, the guy with dreads. Anyway, this is one of the things with me. Names just disappear. Todd White. We'd all like to be like Todd White, who goes around healing people everywhere. But we can't all be that person. And maybe it's just a matter of, maybe I'll never heal or be instigative in healing anybody in the future. But I'll carry on praying, because it's not about me, and it's not about you. It's about belief in God. It's about God choosing who to heal. And whether if we aren't being instrumental in if we aren't being instrumental in praying for people, then God can't step in and heal them. And it's us that have got to be instrumental in praying for people, which allows God to step into that life. Anyway. And then Christ tells them not to take anything with them. He's just told them that they're going out, and he's now telling them not to take anything with them. Wow, what a massive step in their faith and their trust level. Why? To get them to trust wholeheartedly in God. They had to trust in God for everything, to take care of them in every circumstance. And also, if people don't accept you for what you believe, then shake the dust off your feet and move on. This is Christ saying that not everybody is going to accept my message. Not everybody is going to accept me. And it's the same today. Sometimes we bang on to one particular person. Accept Jesus, accept Jesus, accept Jesus. And maybe they aren't ready to accept Jesus. It's a process. In many people's lives, I've been grateful enough to see a girl accept Christ and completely change her life around, to the extent that when she told her teachers that she was going to get baptized, her teachers and her headmistress turned up to the baptism because they couldn't believe the difference in this girl in a couple of weeks. And this girl was one stage away from being kicked out of school because she had been so rowdy and so out of order. As it is now, she's probably 26 or 27 now, and this was when she was about 14. And she instantly changed her life around. And she progressed on to being a nurse. She went through college and university, and she's become a nurse. And that's the power that God has to completely change somebody's life. But in doing that, probably 90% of people don't just have a 180-degree swap. It's a 10 degree at a time changeover in their life. And sometimes we bang on at people about getting saved. Sometimes they'll get saved in a couple of years' time. Sometimes they'll get saved in a couple of months' time. Sometimes they won't get saved. And we have to accept that and brush the dust off our feet and move on. Because maybe it's a matter of they'll get saved with somebody else. You just keep planting seeds. Paul, plant the seeds and let it grow. That's quite true. Plant your seed and then move on. After they had gone out and returned, they went to a mountain where Jesus feeds 5,000. And Jesus waits for the disciples to have had their food and then asks them to feed the multitudes. They don't know what to do. They had been out and about trusting in God. So they tell him there's only this little kid's dinner. And he says, that'll do. And it's a creative miracle. They see Christ creating something out of nothing. And they take the food out to the groups of 50, and it just keeps coming and coming. You can imagine them taking the food out and coming back to Christ, ready to say, well, that's it. And Christ gives them some more, so they take it out and they come back. And this goes on until everyone is fed. And when they clean up, there are 12 baskets full. And the 12 baskets will have been from their dinners. Why do you think there were 12 baskets, not 14 or 10? Because there were 12 of them. And the women would have made sure that they all had lunch prepared for them for going out. When they clean up, the 12 baskets had been left. And this shows that God is the God of more than enough. He didn't just feed the 5,000 to 7,000 people there, but he had enough spare for them to have a second dinner, so to speak, as well. And this was a lesson to the disciples as much as for the people who were there. A miracle on their part and a lesson for the disciples, all rolled into one. A little time goes by and Jesus is praying, and he stops and asks them, "Who do people say I am?" And he gets the regular answers. You're Elijah, you're a prophet. And he must have despaired, because after all of the things that they'd seen, all of the things that they'd gone through, the feeding of the 5,000, the raising of the dead, all of these things, the shutting up of the storm, they still didn't know. But then Peter says, the bolshy, cocky one out of the bunch, says, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus must have thought, thank goodness, somebody has said it. He's made a point of shutting the demons up when they had said it all the way through his ministry. And he basically shut their mouths for them because he didn't want them to be telling his disciples who he was. You can almost feel the relief in what Jesus says. And once Peter said it, it allows Jesus to stop them from telling anybody else. He can unfold to them what is about to happen to him. And it's a turning point. It's a turning point in his whole ministry. And it's sort of downhill from then on. Downhill to Jerusalem. And they must have been back in the land of unbelief again. You've just found out that you were travelling around with the Messiah, the Saviour of the world, and now he's telling you, within 6 months, I'm going to be dead and gone, and I'm going to have left you. And on top of that, they're turning around and going back to Jerusalem, back to the south, back to the place that hates Jesus, where he's going to die. What sort of sense does this make? He's telling them he's going to die, and then immediately he tells the disciples that they are going to suffer for his name's sake. This is enough to scare anybody. And then we have the transfiguration, where Jesus talks to Moses and Elijah, and only Peter, James and John are there. And they must have been frightened silly and vastly excited to see Jesus, your Messiah that you know is the Messiah, talking to Moses and Elijah on top of a hill. Can you imagine seeing Jesus talking to these other two and not being able to tell your friends? And on top of that, they hear the voice of God. God Almighty speaks to them and tells them, this is my boy. This is my boy who I am chuffed to bits with. I am really, really pleased with him. And the others would have thought that they'd seen a mass delusion anyway. I would imagine it came out when Jesus was resurrected, and they were all in the upper room talking, because they all had faith to believe anything at that point. But also another reason for them not telling people potentially was the fact that that Judas was still in their party of disciples, and that may have, if they had shared that information, that may have swayed Judas away from his betrayal. We just don't know. As Jesus comes down from this meeting, he's told the disciples, when he's told the disciples were not able to rid a man's son of a demon, and Jesus calls them out on their lack of belief. He wonders out loud how long he has to be with them before they have confidence to do this on their own. Here we see them squabbling and bickering amongst themselves, and they argue who's the greatest amongst them. After Christ has just chastised them, they were still in the way of the world and not in the way of God's thinking. Well, it's come to 7 o'clock, and I've, as usual, got a load more for you. So if I see you again, we'll carry on. But if I don't, God bless you, and God bless Pastor Bob and the Sanctuary crew, and mighty blessings for all they do and for all they've been doing for years and years. And Pastor Bob is like the face of Sanctuary. He's the swan who floats across the top of the water. And all these other guys, like Scott and everybody else, are like the duck's feet, which are paddling away under the water, making it seamless and great for all of us. God bless. I love you. Bye.